afternoon, or late afternoon, and awaken later, and then go driving on to my determined source where I was going at that time. And it left me in a state of not anxiety, but a feeling of what was it about this place that intrigued me. I did not find out about that until in the last year. From California, I went on to Hawaii. I worked for a company called Hoffman Laboratories as a field engineer for the Navy. Field engineer, actually, for Hoffman, assigned to the Navy at Pearl Harbor. When I arrived there in July of 1955, eventually found a place to live, but I was assigned to the Pearl Harbor Naval Office, a particular section, and my job as a field engineer for Hoffman Labs was, of course, to inspect their equipment that they had built and supplied to the Navy as it came into Pearl Harbor, as the ships came in for not necessarily overhaul, but general reconditioning, check out all equipments and so forth, and many field engineers from different companies would go aboard ship and check out the various pieces of equipment they were connected to through their corporate affiliations. All of the time that I spent in Pearl Harbor, it had a strange effect on me. It felt like I was back home. I couldn't understand then what that was all about, because as Al Bielek, all of my memories of Ed Cameron had been erased. In a sense, it was back home because I had been there in 1941. Perhaps some of the leakage from 41 and my life as Ed Cameron came through to me in 1955 and 56, because I felt quite at home. And I liked walking down the piers and all of this whole area devoted to the ships, and during my assignments, which were literally to inspect Hoffman's equipment aboard ship, make my reports and all of that. I remained there a little over a year, and in that time, one other strange incident occurred which perplexed me for quite a while, that eventually was resolved when, at a later time, my memories of who I really was came back. Through the party connection, the office connections, I was invited to a party one weekend involving some naval officers, some of the civilian people from that office. It was out in, let's say, a more remote area of Honolulu, out in the boonies, more or less. And it was on a Saturday afternoon. This party was thrown by two naval officers who had a connection with the yard. And everybody was having a great time. But as I imbibed a few more drinks, I did drink a little in those days. I was not an alcoholic, but it was customary, shall we say, in view of the company I kept, and particularly when these Navy parties. You had a few drinks. Nothing unusual about that. What was unusual, and I thought about it many times after that, until the meaning of it finally erupted and fell in on me consciously, was that the two guys who threw the party, both lieutenants in the Navy, in a brown fatigue uniform, a tan fatigue uniform, to me had a funny feeling, like these two guys sort of belonged together, and I couldn't quite understand what it meant. And then as I became more inebriated, if you will, I got the feeling, in a certain sense, I identified with one of them. Now, that didn't mean I had any connection with this person. I didn't know him from Adam, other than from the Navy Yard. I had the feeling in some way that I fitted into this picture. And then I was looking mentally at this other officer. He fitted into the picture. Now, who fitted in there? I could never answer that question at that time as to what the other person portrayed, what the other person meant to me. It wasn't for many years, decades afterwards, literally, that I finally figured it out that, to me, on a conscious level connecting with the subconscious, the two officers represented Duncan and myself from our time in Pearl Harbor, when we were much younger. There was a type of thing where the subconscious was starting to break through at least a little bit, and starting to identify on a conscious level with certain events then taking place, namely that party with the two officers. It was a case, looking at it later, where I realized I almost broke through as to identifying a missing part of my past, but I never quite made it. Well, that operation ended in 1956. I returned to the mainland, went through a series of jobs. I'm not going into it. Wound up, wound up in Los Angeles working for Space Technology Laboratories, off and on from 1957 to 1960. And then I moved to Houston, Texas. And then I remained out of the California area until 1984, 83 and 84. At that time, having traveled around the U.S., I met many engineers in many walks of life. And the interesting part of it was, as a consultant, I talked with many of these people who have been strange projects, had strange histories to relate, and quite a few of them had quite a bit of knowledge about things like UFOs. I might add, of course, during this period of time, I had a great interest in the whole subject of UFOs. Was it real or was it not? Was there suppression of information and reports? I was sort of neutral, except I had a great and avid interest at that time, perhaps just as much as in the Philadelphia experiment. In 1951, before I left for the West Coast, through connections of a society I then belonged to, which was the NSS, National Spelunking Society, I met Ivan T. Sanderson. Now, he was in the New York grotto, I was in the Jersey grotto, and I got an invite to come over and visit with him. So I did, and I met him one day and one night. He had an apartment in New York City at that time, off on 45th Street off of Broadway. And I visited him, and we went out for dinner, and we talked about many things, and a very interesting man. I didn't know his whole history then. I learned more later. He was ex-British intelligence who stayed in the United States at the tail end of the war because they were going to ship him back to England on one of the B-26 bombers, and he said the survivability of people on those bombers going across the Atlantic was not very good. So he jumped ship, so to speak, and stayed in New York, went undercover, and then when the war was over, surfaced. He was well known for many years in the Gary Moore shows on TV in New York, of which I did see a few. When in 1952 I went traveling, 53, and then wound up in Los Angeles. I lost connection with him from 1953 until 1963. In 1963 I was in Pennsylvania on an assignment, reconnected with him, and of course we discussed many other things at that time. Some years later, of course, he was trying to determine the history of the Philadelphia experiment because he kept hearing rumors of it himself. And he became very interested, as I did. This was in the late 60s, early 70s, before he died in 1973. He could never, including with his connections with the British intelligence and with the Pentagon, could never get any straight information out of anyone about the Philadelphia experiment. It was totally denied to him. Other than the fact, yes, there was a USS Eldridge, there was a real ship by that name, and that's all the Navy would tell him. That is about all I would learn at that time, and of course a series of books were written later. Thin Air in 1978, and then the Philadelphia Experiment Project Invisibility in 1979, Berlitz and Moore. And all it did in those reports was stir the pot and quite literally brought the subject alive again in the popular press, and it never died from that point on. And I still, at that point, did not know that I had a connection with the project. This did not come for quite a while later. Ivan tried to get to the bottom of it, and he never could. I was on a staff at that time working in a group on a subject matter called mind control, which was very interesting because there wasn't much information available at that time, but I had a great deal of interest. And of course this expanded much later into a full-blown interest, but that came in the 80s and the 90s. Not to get ahead of my story here, Ivan died. I continued what little research I was then doing on myself, and I continued to work in various locations around the country. I had to take a break. In retrospect, dealing with Ivan Sanderson, I did, shall we say, make it into one of his books. There was some reference to myself in one of his books. He wrote many, both on natural phenomena and natural life. The Abominable Snowman, I think, was the first one he ever did, and there was perhaps worldwide acclaim for it. He did a series on various things, and one of them was about undersea civilizations. He did one on UFOs that caught the attention of CIA, NSA, and other intelligence agencies that didn't want him to write it, so he wrote it anyway. He took a number of literary risks, but he always came out on top. It was unfortunate that he and his abilities were lost, but that's the way it goes. His wife had died 13 months to the day prior that he did. The group was broken up, the files remained, and the organization he founded, which I also was a part of, finally went into limbo, and his magazine, which had been published for many years, entitled Pursuit, is no longer published and hasn't been now for almost 10 years. In 1983, I was back to Los Angeles working for a company known as Advanced Semiconductor Products. President Ray Wynn, I mention his name for a very good reason. He, in his own way, was highly frustrated. He was a genius in many respects. He developed a thin film technology, which is today used in the entire semiconductor industry. At that time, there were others making similar films, but he finally mastered the process, took out patents, and eventually collected royalties from everybody. And as the product demand was enormous, the entire industry in the U.S. came to him because what it did in the processing of major, larger size semiconductor chips, the yield was quite low. You had to go in ultra-clean rooms to produce these things, and of course layer after layer is put on these things to make a very complex chip. But if you do not protect it properly from dust, one little mite of dust can ruin the chip, or can actually ruin an entire bowl, or boule as it was called, in which there were many chips being manufactured on this wafer. When they were finished, they were very good, they were cut off, and of course went through further processing. But he found a way to develop a thin film which was totally transparent to light at whatever range they were using, which in some cases included UV light. And the yield jumped remarkably. In some cases it was as low as 20%. He was able to get yields up to 80% and better. Of course they sought after him. He had patents, he was making all kinds of money, and that was the principal thing he had worked on, and then started the company Advanced Semiconductor Products related to his chemical thin film technology, in which I designed some electronic equipment for him. Ray was well known in the industry. He eventually wound up being a multimillionaire and retired from Santa Barbara to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so far as I know, he disappeared several years ago. He did have problems with his heart, and he may have passed on. I have never yet heard fully. But what is important is that in that period of time, 1983-84, the Montauk Project ended. I was still not aware of my involvement in it, and the thing becomes rather difficult to portray, and even more difficult to understand how I could be working two jobs in two locations at the same time. I was working as an engineer in Los Angeles, 83-84, and prior to that, from 76 on, the whole period during which I was involved with the Montauk Project. The beginning phases of the Montauk Project I want to get into, but I want to state that on a Sunday afternoon in August of 1983, when I was sunning myself on a beach in one of the lakes north of Los Angeles, up in the hills, one afternoon, I suddenly had the feeling I was free of something. I just felt a relief and a freedom. That was probably the day the project went down, but I've yet to correlate and find old calendars to see if that was the exact day. Now, how did I get involved with the Montauk Project? And the second question I will answer later is, how could I possibly be working in Los Angeles and on Long Island at the same time, or what appeared to be the same time? In 65 and 66, let's go back a little further, 55 and 56, I was in Hawaii working for the Navy Department, as I'd already stated. There was one night when I was sitting on the seawall outside the Royal Hawaiian Hotel in Waikiki, as I lived in Waikiki in an apartment there during this period. I was sitting there quite late at night and relaxing, the Hawaiian music around me and the people going by. It was a very relaxing atmosphere there, at least it was in those days. I quite literally fell asleep on the seawall, sitting up, something I was known to do occasionally, and woke up perhaps an hour and a half later feeling like something very strange had happened. had not the slightest idea what it was and didn't know what it was until many years later. That was the point, as I determined after I recovered my memories of Montauk, which started in 1986. That was the point at which I was inducted into the Montauk Project. The man who was a station master, and I'm referring to the Montauk Air Force Station operations, which became what we call the Montauk Project, started up approximately in 1968 with the advent of the German scientists moving out there, and then later incorporating the services of various extraterrestrial groups, all of which I had to work with. But I did not become involved with the project myself until 1976, and that was when it became more or less official and went online. Online then meant, of course, a lot of breaks in the process, a lot of further engineering to make the time tunnel system work properly. But my first recollection of the involvement in the project, and this took place from 1956 up to 1976, was being in the office of the station master, a man by the name of Jack Pruitt. Pruitt is known somewhat through the industry, more perhaps the banking industry than anything else, because knowing his son and having met him and talked with him several times, he still lives in the New York, Long Island area. He didn't know that his father was a station master of the project, but we've later proved it. He had me in his office, questioning me, and a series of events preceded that involving certain bars on the island of Waikiki and meeting people whom I didn't know who they were, who would disappear. And later on I worked with that same individual because he was bird dogging me to find out if I was the person that Jack was looking for. So I find myself in his office, and of course he's asking me about my history, what I've done, what I was doing as what I was doing as an engineer. I have an understanding, you have an interest in UFOs. Oh yes, I do. I wasn't perhaps that overtly direct about it at that point. He says, well, if you have an interest in it, how would you like to see one? Oh, I became quite interested at that point, so he took me into one of the underground facilities of Montauk. And I might add at this point, you not only have the surface facility, the buildings and the tower and all of this, which can be seen readily, but now sealed off, but then open, was a complete underground labyrinth of 6 levels, and adjacent to and a part of these 6 levels of underground, which were built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers between the beginning of the century and the major construction began in 1928 and 1933, as I've seen the blueprints. They built a huge underground facility which overlapped into an underground cavern system. There's very extensive underground caverns under Long Island, and they are, in a sense, part of the Montauk Project. And the Montauk Project can be accessed through the underground tunnels if you know where to enter. But he took me into one of the underground chambers, one of the underground rooms. This one was a natural one. And there was sitting a very large gold-colored UFO, approximately 60 feet in diameter, sitting on a tripod, literally barely making it fitting in this room. The question was, how did it get there? Well, he didn't answer that question for me at that time. But it was there, and it was trapped, and it was obvious it would never get out. So he asked me a question, well, how would you like to work on this? Well, the bait had been thrown, and I'd been hooked. And of course, I said, yes, I'd like to work on this. So I became a part of the Montauk Project. I might point out that every one of the people who worked at Montauk, in essence, were volunteers. And there were no salaries paid to any of these people who volunteered. And those military personnel that were still involved with the project were TDY, temporary duty, paid out of whatever their normal billet was, so that no monetary exchange in terms of government money was ever recorded directly connectable to Montauk. They maintained a high degree of secrecy and were very successful at it. I spent literally most of my time from 1976 to 1983 in the underground at Montauk. Now, how could I do this when at the same time I was an engineer working on the outside? There were 2 aspects of this. One is more readily explainable than the other. Aspect number one was, as I found out in later research, I knew then, and I didn't at that time in 1976 know about it. I only knew that I went on an underground railroad system which connected Los Angeles to Newark, New Jersey, and then the interchange system at Newark went on out under New York to Long Island with two stops. One was at the EIL Corporation Complex in Farmingdale, Long Island, and the last stop was at Montauk Point. This underground rail system, which has been testified to by Phil Schneider before he died, as he said he personally worked on constructing it, is a very strange, basically alien technology design rail system which does not have any rails. We call it a rail system for convenience. It's actually magnetic levitation, operates at extremely high speed, and the tunnels bored 14 feet in diameter. Between New York and Los Angeles, you can make that trip in 2 hours. That's faster than any aircraft other than supersonic, which do not fly over the U.S. by law. And I did ride that thing fairly regularly. There are points of entrance. I remember some of them, but not most of them. And this network is all over the U.S., into Canada, probably into Mexico at this time. It definitely goes into Puerto Rico. And so far as I know, no underwater connections to Europe, but there's a system all over Europe and through Russia. This is a vast underground network interconnecting underground as well as surface bases and locations. I used to ride that rather regularly, and that I can understand, making a high-speed trip out to Montauk and then coming back in 2 hours and resuming my normal life and duties after having that part which I worked on at Montauk erased. That part is understandable. The other aspect, which is not so understandable, is how I could spend so many years out there working on these projects, overlapping the time when I was also an engineer working on the outside in normal civilian or semi-government operations. To explain this more fully, and I'm sure it will not sit too well with some of the people listening with this, but I'll have to tell it the way I know it. What the German scientists were working on at Montauk, and with alien help, finally were able to perfect, was a time tunnel. They call it a tunnel for a reason, because in the later aspects, not the earliest research, it was underground, involved a series of special antennas which produced with some very complex electronics